Hello, everyone. Thank you for coming. It's great to see you all here. I want to start by just reading a short passage from the preface of the book. And this is kind of a way for me to kind of give you a sense of the philosophy behind this book, and also to present to you some of my reasons for writing a book about objects that might seem kind of mundane and boring, right? So this is a book about desks and pens and jewelry and sewing and things like this, right? So this is kind of a presentation of why these objects matter to me, and hopefully they'll matter to you too. Okay. The strange bed in Emily Bronte's Wuthering Heights has always haunted me. We read about Catherine Earnshaw's large oak case before we know anything about her. A wooden box entered via sliding panels. It has cutout squares near the top that resemble coach windows, as if one might crawl in to travel somewhere. The cabinet, its own little private room within a room, encloses a window and its ledge, where Catherine long ago stacked her small library and scratched her name into the paint. She once read there, scribbling her diary in the margins of her books. As one who favors reading in bed, I find this oak box charged with meaning, especially when encountered while settled in my own bed, the lamp a circle of warmth carved out of the late night darkness. Just as the wardrobe in C.S. Lewis's The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe is moved through by the children until the layers of fur coats become flakes of snow and tree branches, the bed opens into other worlds, the plenitude of the imagination. Heathcliff believes in this capability too. He gets into the dead Catherine's box, believing he can find her. He perishes there himself. And the novel hints that the bed provides a portal to another sphere, the one of ghosts. There are few books I'd rather carry me late into the night than Jane Eyre, Wuthering Heights, and Villette. Few books whose worlds I'd rather crawl into and inhabit. I have even felt somehow known by their heroines, as if they might recognize me when I enter their spheres. I move around in those rooms with Jane or Lucy, sit in the antechamber of Bertha Mason's prison, and also peer with wonder as the candlelight plays over, quote, the doors of a great cabinet opposite, whose front, divided into 12 panels, bore in grim design the heads of the 12 apostles, each enclosed in its separate panel as in a frame, end quote. My intimacy with these books has led me, like so many others, to want to come closer to their authors. So alive are these novels that I wish I could resurrect the Brontes themselves, their daily living and breathing, their material presence. Catherine's box bed and the cabinet with the apostles' heads glimmer with animation, seeming to lift off the page. I remember the uncanny sensation when I saw the real apostles' cabinet, a 17th century Dutch cupboard that Charlotte encountered when visiting a grand house with her friends, which she then transported to the top of Thornfield Hall in Jane Eyre. Did Emily as well base her oak sleeping closet on one she actually saw? If so, does it still exist somewhere? Even ordinary objects can carry us to other times and places. Old things gain an extra patina of significance for this reason. Take, say, a striped dress from the 1940s, hemmed by hand, that I found in a thrift store. Holding it makes me wonder, what did it witness? What did the wearer feel and see with this very fabric against her skin? That body may well now be dead. Still, I feel the deep mystery of the lives of others in this palpable emissary of past moments, now impossible to recover. The texture of those lost days settles into possessions that outlived their owners. It seems to linger in a mended tear, a stretched elbow, a corner's roundedness. Resurrecting this old matter by wearing or using it feels almost as if we respect the absent, whomever they might be, call them back for a brief moment before the door shuts for good. We too will leave behind things we have nicked with incident, warmed with wearing. Will they carry our history, abide in our place without us? Will our clothing still bear our gestures? The Victorians were more likely than we are to find remnants of selfhood in possessions that belonged to their dead. Their culture had less squeamishness about the dead body than ours usually does. Sentimental thoughts about corpses were cultivated in many circles. Dying happened mostly at home, and then the living swept into the rooms and beds of the dead and kept on using them. The fashioning of death masks was still common, and the photographing of corpses had its day. A lock of hair taken from a corpse connected the living, many believed, to an afterlife where the dead resided. A nightshirt, a ring, a book, infused with the past, might reanimate it when approached with all the senses. I was struck by a sense of bodies long gone when I held the artifacts I describe in the following chapters. Books especially bear the leavings of inky, soiled, or oily fingerprints and palms. The Brontes scribbled, doodled, and inscribed in their books, stuck plants, drawings, visiting cards in them, making their presence manifest. Some of these well-used volumes transmitted even more than evidence of reading. They had a certain scent to them, which seemed to my nose a fleshy smell. I was lucky to be able to touch, often without gloves, turn over, bring close, and even sniff the things I handled in libraries and museums. My great fortune reminded me of the attenuation of all the senses but sight in most museums today. We look and only look at things behind glass. It is hard to imagine how this could be different, since we want these works to be preserved, to last, yet it once was. In the 17th and 18th centuries, museums still retain some aspects of the private collections from which they grew, and visitors were invited to touch artifacts on display. A woman in 1786 described a trip to the British Museum where she reached into an ancient Greek urn to caress the ashes. Quote, "I felt it gently, with great feeling. I pressed the grain of dust between my fingers tenderly, just as her best friend might once have grasped her hands," end quote. When one Zacharias Conrad von Uffenbach visited the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford in 1710, he complained that, quote, "even the women were allowed in. They run around here and there grabbing at everything," end quote. I want to do this, actually, the next museum I go into, with all my friends, my female friends. When the Victorian collector Captain Henry Lane Fox, who later took the name Pitt Rivers, began gathering tools, art, and ceremonial items from all over the world so that the, quote, "lineaments of past ordinary lives," end quote, would be revealed. He wanted people to come to his collection, now the Pitt Rivers Museum in Oxford, and, quote, "hold in their hand an idea expressed by the hands," end quote. What I set out to do here is place each object in its cultural setting and in the moments of the everyday lives of the Brontes. I coax out what the thing might have witnessed, this is in quotes, witnessed, how it colored its human settings. Through the eyes of thread, paper, wood, jet, hair, bone, brass, fur, frond, leather, velvet, and ash, new corners and even rooms of these Victorian women's lives light up for us. There has been little writing on most of these artifacts, on some not a jot. I find these things and their Victorian mates wholly beguiling. I wish with all my heart that they would step forth and speak, maybe even rise from the page. If they unlock themselves only a little, are brought to voice, then my task has been accomplished. Thank you.
I'm going to start with objects. You talk about the Victorians viewing objects as almost being imbued with souls. How did the way that the people of the time saw objects influence the way you approached the ones in your book?
Well, I think that this project started, as many people in this room know, I think, this project started with my interest in hair jewelry, right? So Victorian jewelry made out of human hair. And I actually discovered these objects first when I was teaching a class at Hunter College many years ago, and I was teaching Jane Austen's Sense and Sensibility. If those of you who've read it recently, there's a hair ring in that novel, and one of my students said, "What is a hair ring?" And I said, "I have no idea what that is." And so I did research on it, and I discovered what that was, and I became really interested in these sort of death-related objects, or in objects or jewelry made out of like parts of the body, or in any case hair. So I think that in some sense for me it was, I started thinking about the ways that Victorians thought of objects as kind of having some sort of subjectivity, we might say. But actually, even before I was interested in Victorian objects, I was always interested in objects. So I'm going to back off of what I was saying about that whole question, because I think that I've always been interested in antiques and old things and going to thrift stores and especially vintage clothing. And so it was only when I started, I already was interested in these things, and once I started researching the Victorian interest in objects, it just sort of meshed with how I already felt about objects. So, yeah.
I was wondering, do you have any hair jewelry on?
I'm actually not wearing any hair jewelry tonight, which is kind of an unusual event. Although I have one friend in here who I won't point out because I might not want to embarrass her, who is wearing earrings that have hair in them, Victorian era, I think, earrings that have hair. Although I am wearing a ring that looks like it has a tooth in it. You might be interested to see, although it's not actually a tooth, as it turns out. But yeah.
Pull out, since you don't have any on.
Oh, right.
Jacket does.
Yeah, on the cover of this jacket is a bracelet made out of the intertwined or braided hair of Anne Brontë and Emily Brontë. So the actual sides of this bracelet are woven hair of Emily and Anne Brontë. So that gives you a sense of what a lot of hair jewelry looks like. Looks like that. Yeah.
So it looks real, and then you find the hair.
What did you say?
It looks kind of like regular jewelry, and then you see the hair.
Yeah, and in fact, it's a bit of a. Once you become interested in hair jewelry, then you begin to see it everywhere, and you also realize that some Victorian or old jewelry that you didn't realize had hair does have hair, right? So if you go into an antique store, before you know about the hair thing, you might not notice that there is hair in those pieces. You're just looking at pieces and there's something dark back there behind a little window, right? But once you learn about hair jewelry, then when you look in that window, you start to learn both what might contain hair or what is hair, but you also learn about the fact that a lot of jewelry have compartments for hair, and the hair's not always in there, right? So I've seen a lot of Victorian era jewelry and earlier that has like little compartments where hair would be, but where the hair has not been either put there or was thrown away at some point because people were kind of disgusted by the hair or something. Yeah.
How did you decide which objects to put in, since there are so many you could have chosen?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think it was sort of a mixed approach. I mean, I think mostly it was the fact that it was the objects that interested me the most, right? I saw over 100 Brontë-related objects when I was doing research for this book, and I thought to myself, which objects speak to me? Many of the objects that I write about in this book are related to their writing careers, right? So their desks are really obvious things you might want to write about if you're writing about writers, right? Pens and pencils are clear. Paper, letters, those are all very obvious things you would want to pick, right? But I think it was also just like it was interest for me. And I also had to make sure, I had to feel confident that the objects I was choosing were authentic, because I found when I was doing this kind of research, and before I wrote this book, I wrote a book on Victorian era relics, and so I was doing a lot of material object research, and I was looking at a lot of like personal effects and things, and I came to realize that a lot of these objects were probably not authentic, because I think that a lot of people wanted to say they owned Brontë-related objects, and then a lot of these objects then enter into the museum system in the 19th century, and then they get authenticated as authentic, Brontë-owned objects or whatever. And I just had my doubts about a lot of objects. And so that was hard, actually, because I might find an object I thought was really great and really wonderful. And in fact, I think it's the last chapter of the book, I talk about one object that I fell in love with and wanted to write a chapter on, and started writing a chapter on it and started doing research on it. And then I realized this is definitely not this is a fraud. This is a fraudulent object. And it's two pieces of jet. It's from a mourning bracelet made out of jet that has been disassembled, and there's only two pieces of it left. And what seems to be the case is that Emily Brontë has carved her name in one side of it, and Charlotte Brontë has carved her name in the other side. Now you can imagine me, I mean, just from what I read just now, even if you don't know me, seeing this object and getting really excited and saying, this is exactly the kind of thing I want to write about. And I started writing the chapter, and then I started doing research, and I discovered that Stella Gibbons gave the object to the Brontë parsonage. No, gave the object to Winifred Jaron, who is a kind of famous Brontë biographer. And when Stella Gibbons gave it to her, Stella Gibbons, of course, is the author of Cold Comfort Farm, which is a kind of send-up kind of novels like Wuthering Heights. It kind of makes fun of novels like Wuthering Heights. And when Stella Gibbons gave it to Winifred Jaron, this is like in the 1970s, she tells a very mysterious story about how she found it. And I thought to myself, this is not authentic. It just isn't. It just can't be.
It's worth you a lot of money, and why would she give it to someone she doesn't quite love?
And also didn't like. Yeah, she didn't like Winifred Jaron. So, yeah.
As you've been going through the objects, and I know you've taught all the Brontë books a lot and read them numerous times.
Actually, I haven't taught all the Brontë books. Yeah, I've never taught The Professor.
Okay.
Has anyone in here read The Professor? A couple of you have read The Professor, but only 3 people. You've read it?
No, I own it.
You own it. Okay.
You have to read it.
It's one of Charlotte Bronte's novels it was her first novel. I mean, it was her first serious novel, let's say, or her first adult novel. And it's just not. I don't know. It's not a wonderful novel. I've never taught it in any case, but you might disagree with me. Polly, you might disagree with me. You don't disagree with me? Okay.
But so you've read these a lot. You've taught all but one. Now you're coming at it through the perspective of these objects. Did you find yourself reading the novels themselves differently?
I did, yeah. I mean, once you start, for instance, I have a chapter on dog collars, right? So Emily Brontë had a dog named Keeper, who was a big sort of bull mastiff mix. And Keeper wore a heavy brass collar with an inscription on it, and that brass collar still exists. It's at the Brontë Parsonage Museum. And so once I started researching that chapter, I was thinking about dogs and dog collars, and I was obsessed with dogs and dog collars. And so once I read all the Brontë books over again, and I was thinking about dogs, I read Wuthering Heights, and I had never noticed how many dogs are in Wuthering Heights. I don't know if, I'm hoping many of you have read Wuthering Heights, and maybe recently. But it's full of dogs. And it's full of dogs that are both kind of violent and kind of scary, but it's also full of dogs that are treated really badly, right? So Hareton hangs puppies from the back of a chair, like he kills them by hanging them, and dogs get kicked, and Heathcliff hangs a spaniel, on a handkerchief, and tries to kill this spaniel that way. So yeah, definitely. And also once you start thinking about portable desks, and you start reading Victorian novels and you're thinking about portable desks, and you start to see portable desks everywhere, like in every single novel, on every single page almost. So
this is getting to the heart of the Brontes, but all the Brontes were obsessed with writing and reading. Do you think this was because of their father, or they had nothing else to do, but what was that obsession? I mean, to the point where they wrote those tiny little books, or wrote constantly on pieces of paper in a million places.
Yeah, I think it's hard to say exactly, but certainly their father was himself a published writer, and was a very serious man. Went to Cambridge. They had a lot of books in their house, although they also borrowed a lot of books. There's a lot of debate about where they got their books from, but they probably got them from one of these subscription libraries, or they got them from a local library in Haworth. But also their mother, I mean, of course their mother died when they were quite young, but still, their mother was also a published writer. And we have some of her letters, some of the love letters that she wrote to her husband, Patrick Brontë, before they were married. And she seemed, again, even though the children died she died when the children were quite young, I still feel that her kind of intelligence and her sort of writing and reading was also important to them. Yeah.
Question about how the Brontes felt about women's rights of the time, or the position of women, and how can you tell from their letters or through their novels what their thoughts were?
It's a hard question to answer. We have very few letters of Anne Brontë and Emily Brontë. We have like 3 that Emily Brontë wrote, and all of them are really formal kinds of letters. They're not personal, they're not long. I think we have, I don't know, maybe 5 that Anne wrote, or maybe a few more than that, but again, they're not very personal. Well, I guess one of them's kind of personal, but anyway, there's not very many. There's not a lot of documents that tell us what Anne and Emily Brontë felt about anything except for their writing. And what you can say about women's rights from reading Wuthering Heights, I don't know what to say about that. I mean, I think that Catherine Earnshaw is very much a powerful female figure, and I think we are meant to see that what happens to her is tragic, that she kind of feels forced to marry, not forced, but she makes a bad decision and marries this kind of this man who's has a lot of social status, and that sort of ends up ruining her life in a sense, because she doesn't get to have Heathcliff, who's the person that she really wants. But Heathcliff, of course, has been turned into a kind of like servant, working class man, which means that she doesn't feel like she can marry him. So I don't know. I think with Charlotte's a pretty clear case. I mean, she was definitely a feminist. And we have a lot of Charlotte's letters. We've got like 300 of Charlotte's letters. And we can see this in Jane Eyre. There's a famous feminist statement about, women. Why are women forced to, sit around and make puddings and play the piano and knit stockings? Why can't they go out and work like men? Also, Shirley is a super feminist book. Although I think in her letters we get a kind of mixed story. I mean, she wasn't like an agitator for female rights exactly. So yeah, I think it's kind of hard to answer that question. It's complicated to answer that. It's a complicated answer. Yeah.
What do you think of the ending of Jane Eyre?
I had some long discussions recently with a class of mine. I was teaching Jane Eyre recently, and my feelings about the ending of Jane Eyre have changed over the years. I feel like a long time ago when I was much younger, I loved the end. I thought it was really romantic. But at some point as I got older, I began to feel disappointed in the ending, because I feel like it's... how I want Jane Eyre to end is I want Jane to stay with her 2 cousins, Diana and Mary, in the little house on the moors, reading and learning German. And she loves it there, and she's so happy to find her kinship with these women, and they get along so well. And I think, why can't it end there? Why does she have to then go off and marry the man? And the thing that bothers me the most about the end of Jane Eyre is that Jane and Rochester are basically alone. Right, they go off into the woods, into this kind of unhealthy place, where Rochester would not put Bertha because she would have died there because it's so unhealthy. They go there and they don't really see anyone. They're like a couple, right? They retreat into coupledom, however you say that, couplehood. And so I think Jane loses almost all of her female friends. I mean, she sees them occasionally, like once a year or something, but I think once a year is not enough. So I guess I have mixed feelings about the end, but I'm mostly disappointed by it these days. Yeah, and I'm sure that there are lots of people here who disagree with me, and you can bring this up during the Q&A. We can fight it out.
Okay. You talk a lot, and you've talked some here, about the letters the Brontes wrote, well, particularly Charlotte wrote so many letters, and obviously we don't have all of them. So 300 is quite a bit. And you also talk in the chapter about the letters about how mail was so different, that the person who received the letter actually paid the postage for the letter, and that there was mail like 3 times a day, unlike today. Do you feel that changed what society was like in a general way? How communication was and how people felt about friendship?
Yeah, definitely. One thing that was fascinating about researching letters in relation to Charlotte Bronte's letters is that she was living during a time when there was major postal reforms, and you can see the reforms happening in her actual letters. So if you study the envelopes, the outsides of the envelopes, you can see the change from I'm forgetting the term for this, but pay upon delivery, right? So if you had to pay when the letter was delivered to you, that's when you paid, as opposed to buying a stamp in advance and putting it on the letter and then sending it, so paying before it's delivered. You can see those changes on Charlotte's letters, which I thought was really exciting to be able to trace those changes, to see her starting to use stamps, and to see her starting, for a while, that before stamps became really the thing, there were these really fantastic envelopes that it was the envelope itself that carried the stamp. So you would buy an envelope for a penny, and that was actually the stamp. It had a special embossed area on it. But then stamps became very popular, and so then she started using stamps. But we see it actually in her letters. She writes about how happy she is with the postal reforms because now she can write more. Because it became much, much cheaper to send letters after the postal reforms. Basically, before the postal reforms, it was an incredibly inefficient and expensive system, as you might imagine, since the carrier had to carry the letter to the person. That person had to like fumble around in their house and in their wallet, like looking for money. And if they didn't have the money, they had to turn away the carrier, which was really embarrassing to people. And a lot of people had to turn away the postal carrier and not without getting their letter because they didn't have the money. To this system where you could pay just a penny for a stamp for most of the UK and send even an enclosure, right? So it used to be the case that before the postal reform, that an enclosure would be extra, right? So if you stuck a letter in an envelope or a lock of hair in an envelope or something in a letter, then you'd have to pay double postage. Whereas after the postal reform, you could use envelopes, you could stick things in there, you could stick multiple letters in there. And so we see sort of Charlotte Bronte's excitement, especially when she writes to her best friend Ellen Nussey, because they were writing, I don't know, on a weekly or more than weekly, double, I don't know, they were writing many letters to each other. There was more than 500 that were written, although most of them don't exist anymore, or many of them don't. And so she was really excited that she could send more, right? She could write more. And after postal reform, we see also just the kind of explosion of letter writing, because suddenly almost everyone could afford to write letters. And before this, most people couldn't afford to write letters. And so with the explosion of letter writing, we find beautiful stationery is kind of invented, and new sorts of envelopes and new ways of sealing letters. And of course, there was a stamp craze of collecting stamps, right? People got really excited about collecting stamps. And so it actually really, the postal, when I had to research this chapter on postal reform, I thought, oh, this is going to be really boring. And it was actually incredibly exciting, and it was actually one of my favorite chapters because I found that postal reform is really interesting. I mean, it really is. Trust me on this. It's really interesting.
I think we're going to open it up to others.
Yeah.
Right?
Does anybody have any questions or stories for Deborah tonight? I'm going to start in the middle.
Hi, Deborah. It's Anne. I just can't let you get away with saying that the ending of Jane Eyre is Reader, I Married Him. It's not the end of the novel. It ends with St. John Rivers dying in India, and I just thought maybe you would want to comment about that as the ending.
Yeah, no, you're right. I screwed up. Yes, it ends with St. John Rivers dying in India, and I find that ending really puzzling. Really, really puzzling. And I have thought different things about it, and I've read a lot of different articles that people have thought about the ending, about that ending. You're right, that's how it ends. And I don't know what to say about it. I mean, I guess I'll say that it seems to me like it's a way of closing the book because he dies, and there's like death at the close of the book, even though Jane Eyre has herself not died yet, and she's got children and they're still alive, and Rochester's still alive when the book ends. I don't know, Anne, do you want to share it with us? And not to put you on the spot, you don't have to if you don't want to, but what do you think? I know you've taught Jane Eyre a million times, more than I have.
No, I mean, I find it very puzzling too, but it shifts the narrative out from the personal and out from their retreat into the country, out into the world, right? Because he goes into India as a missionary, and of course he wanted her to go with him, right? So it's almost a pull back from the personal. It's almost a pull back from that retreat of the into coupledom and out into the world. I mean, the fact that he dies, of course, complicates that, but it seems like it widens out at the end.
I know. Well, I've always found it weird that that's how she ends the book. It's very strange. But you're right. There is a kind of pulling back into the world. I mean, that's a great way of putting it. But it still, though, somehow doesn't save, so to speak, to me, that doesn't save the ending. I mean, it doesn't save the fact that Jane and Rochester retreat into the woods, even though, you know. So, yeah. Of course. He's lost a leg and an arm. Yeah, he's been castrated. Do you like how I said that? Castrated. Yeah, I mean, I don't know if I think he's been castrated, but some people say he has. But yeah, that's a whole nother. We could talk for an hour about that, about the castration, but we won't.
Other questions or comments?
You spoke about your imagination and how the objects stimulate your imagination. The question is, does that happen to you in real time today when you look at objects that we are currently using and
I think for me, objects, well, sometimes yes, but generally it's the case that objects have to be from the past in order for me to feel that.
From the distant past?
I mean, 1950s, 40s, 30s. I don't know how distant that is, but so not so distant. Because I feel like, I think that part of my interest in this whole project is that I feel that objects, something happened to them. They had a life. They had a life with people in the past, right? Whether it's an old chair that you have, that chair, a worn chair, you've seen it's been worn, you don't know who used it, you don't know who sat in it, but you know someone sat in it. It sat in someone's house for a period of time. There's something about that I find incredibly fascinating. Even if I don't know anything about the chair, I just know that it's from 1910 or whatever. So for me, there are some objects I see today that I can sort of, I find really fetching and interesting, and they're new. I think the way to compare it a little bit is to art objects, right? So you go to an art museum and you see a painting that was made last year or whenever, and it speaks to you in some way. It's different, but it's kind of similar, I think. Yeah.
Can objects lose their interest as time goes on?
Well, I think that's one thing that's really sad and interesting about doing research on hair is that you find in a random local museum, you find a lock of hair in an envelope, and it's no longer has a name even attached to it. And you have no idea whose hair it is. You don't know who saved it, whose head it came from. Now it's just a lock of hair, and then you have to ask yourself, what's the value of a lock of hair? Well, there is no value to a lock of hair, especially if it's not connected to any story. You know that the hair was connected to some story at some point because it was cut and saved, but you don't know what that story is. And so I think those locks of hair feel kind of like unmarked graves, once they've lost their moorings from the stories that used to attach to them, Yeah.
Following on that comment, sorry, I had the thing, I'll hand it on to the next person. I heard you give an earlier version of this book some time ago, and I think you were working on it while you were working on your Victorian relics book, is that right? And being that this is a story about the Brontes whose artifacts have value, how did that work for you working with 19th century objects that had no outright value in the same way, and how did this project take shape in relation to that project about relics in Victorian culture?
Yeah, that project definitely happened first, and this project grew out of that one, and they overlapped in interesting ways. Interesting to me, but to no one else. But yeah, I think that in the relics book, I was really interested in what I call ordinary objects, so objects that belong to people who weren't famous, like not celebrity objects. Of course, one thing I find, and this is obvious if you think about it, is that the ordinary objects most of them don't exist anymore. Because they've been thrown away, because no one cared about those people, or not for very long. Eventually they got thrown away. This is obviously true of hair. And so if you want to do research on objects from the 19th century, you have to base it on famous people, because that's the only kind of research you can do. And so then the question was, like, which famous people should I pick, to write about objects? And then, of course, the Brontes were obvious, too. I mean, for all kinds of reasons. I mean, because their books are really kind of gothic and creepy and interesting, because their books are full of objects, because a lot of the objects that they own still remain, because their house has been turned into a museum, that you can go visit, and because there's been so much writing on the Brontes that especially on their lives and their biographies, that you can feasibly do that research. I have written on hair jewelry and talked about anonymous hair jewelry, but it's just, you can't really give the backstory. It's very hard to give the backstory of a piece of hair jewelry that you buy on eBay, unless it belonged to someone famous, and then you can do that backstory, or some of it in any case, yeah.
Do you have a favorite object that didn't make it into the book?
Gosh. I don't know. I can't think of any. I mean, there must be some, but I can't come up with them right now. I tried to pack a bunch of objects in there. I really did. I packed all my favorite objects in there. I mean, not all of them are pictured, that's for sure. But I packed a ton of objects in there. In fact, that was one of my main, what's the point? One of my main sort of driving forces is, like, how many objects can I pack in here? And to the point where some people who will remain unnamed, who read this book in its earlier stages, said to me, there's just too many objects here. There's like a list of objects. You can't just have a list of objects. And so I had to take a lot of the objects out. So yeah, I don't know. I mean, I think there's some like objects that don't exist that I wish existed. That, I mean, for instance, I really wanted to write, I wrote a chapter about Emily Brontë walking on the moors. So it's a chapter about walking. And I really wanted to find a pair of Emily Brontë shoes. And there are no shoes that exist that belong to Emily Brontë, as far as we know. And so that was really frustrating for me. It was like the absent shoes. Why can't I find those shoes? And so I had to settle for a walking stick, and it wasn't really quite the right object. And so it was really hard. And we talked about that chapter, trying to figure out, like, which object can we choose for this chapter, because there are no shoes. Yeah, so.
Pass this down, please.
Hi, Deborah. Thank you. I just would like to ask you if you believe in magic, because so much of what you're talking about seems to be about the way we imbue objects with meaning, with aura, and I'm wondering if you write about magic and conjuring and seances, because it seems that's a part of both your work and the things you love. And then the related question, which touches on several people's remarks, is what objects in your daily life are you aware of imbuing with your own meaningful aura that might be conjurable to some future scholar or reader?
Yeah. I do not believe in magic. I'll say that to begin with. But I do write about magic a lot, especially about spiritualism, because I agree that, especially in terms of hair jewelry and mourning jewelry, right? So many people who believed in the afterlife cut locks of hair because they believed that the actual presence of the dead person would kind of linger around the hair, would be a connection to an afterlife. But I also will say that a lot of theorists of material culture, especially philosophers and people who do like object-oriented ontology and speculative realism, actually seem to believe on some level that objects have a kind of agency, or at the very least that objects have secret lives that we can't have access to. And I really like this idea, but I actually don't believe it. I think it's totally malarkey. Yeah, it is like that. But then with my relic book, I spent a lot of time researching the Catholic belief in relics, which to me, I mean, I'm an atheist, so I actually believe that's a form of belief in magic. The fact that, body parts could levitate, or could heal people, or could exude perfume, or whatever. I think that's a form of magic as well. And I also talk about animal magnetism in this book. Animal magnetism was a belief that there was a kind of fluid that was in the world, and that it created a connection between people who were far away, and also between objects and people. So you might feel a certain magic coming off of a lock of hair because of animal magnetism, because it was somehow connected to someone who was far away, either dead or maybe they were still in this life. So yeah, and it's funny that the last part of your question, I recently wrote an article for the Sunday Review section of the New York Times, and I write about hair, and in that article I write about wishing I'd cut the hair from, cut a lock of hair from my sister-in-law who died suddenly and tragically, and I didn't ever cut her hair and didn't have it, and now she's buried and I can't have it. But at the end of the piece I actually speculate on if anyone will ever want my hair. And I actually got a lot of requests for my hair after that. I have 4 so far. I have enough that I'm worried about it because I don't have a lot of hair, and so I have to kind of preserve. I have to wait and let it grow out more, and then cut a lock and let it grow. Yeah, I'm giving. The people who are serious are getting locks of my hair. Yeah. Be careful. Yeah, no, these aren't strangers. These are all friends. I mean, some strangers actually did ask me, but I'm not going to give them the handy hair. There's not enough hair to go around for strangers. What'd you say?
Etsy lets you sell hair and teeth.
I'm sure they do. I'm sure that does. Yeah.
Hello?
Hello.
Hello. I guess it works. I'd like to take you back to what you said about Charlotte Brontë being a feminist and ask if you could comment on the scene in Villette of the little dramatic performance where Ginevra Fanshawe, who is the ultimate woman taking advantage of a woman's place in a man-run world. She gets everything she wants by being the woman that men want. And she's in this play with poor Lucy, who has to play the man's part because all the girls in the school agree, she can't pass as a woman.
Right, right.
She refuses to wear trousers because that would be violating her nature as a woman.
But she does sort of cross-dress a little bit.
Yeah, but everybody makes fun of her. And somehow, is that a scene that a feminist wrote?
Well, there's a lot of cross-dressing in Charlotte Bronte's novels. And, Rochester dresses as an old gypsy woman. We have that scene where she wears I'm kind of forgetting exactly what she wears. I'm sure there are people in this room who are who remember exactly what she's wearing. But she wears like a little tie or something around her neck. She wears a kind of like... Yeah, she's a man from the waist up. That's right. So she does cross-dress a little bit. I think that Villette's a really interesting book and a really interesting case. I mean, Lucy Snow is a kind of yes, I think Lucy Snow is written by a feminist, but I think she's a complicated figure. She's kind of, and there's some people I know in here who will disagree with me, but I'm going to say it anyway. I think she's a person who's hard to like. She's prickly, and she's purposely prickly, and she's hard to get close to. And
It's hard to like or sympathize with in that scene.
She's hard to like or sympathize with, I think, throughout the entire book. Personally, I think. I mean, I love that book, and I think she's great, but I find her hard to get close to, and. But I don't think, though, that means that, I do still think that Charlotte Brontë was a feminist, despite that. Yeah.
The scene with Rochester as a gypsy is another problem. That scene was written by someone who had never met a man.
That can't be true. Of course Charlotte Brontë met men.
No, I know, but it seems like only someone who didn't know.
I mean, at that point, she had sex with a man because she was married. She was married to a man at that point. No, she wasn't. I'm sorry. That's wrong. But anyway, she knew men. She knew men.
She writes it from a point of view that doesn't take into account that is a very difficult disguise to carry off. She writes it as if it's a pretend thing, the way it would be in a Renaissance play.
It would be difficult to pull off. But I think we should have a party sometime where all the men dress up as old gypsy women, and then we can sort of see like who can pull it off. And the women can dress up like Lucy Snow in Villette with the little sort of like man from the top up, and we can see like how it works.
Any other questions out there tonight? All right, this is going to be our last one.
Well, you mentioned, that some of these objects might seem morbid to us now, like to keep somebody's hair or keep a piece of somebody's clothing or something who's dead, or a death mask, or these kinds of things. Do you sense that this era in English history is particular to the Victorian age in terms of their comfort level with that, and it's really us that are so that it's just particular to their age, or is it that we're actually strangers to most of our history in terms of our discomfort with it?
I think we're strangers to most of our history. This is not particular to the Victorian age. I mean, when I was researching the relic book, which I have a chapter where I go all the way back to, I don't know how far I go back to, but I go back pretty far, like pre-medieval. And it's a very ancient practice, collecting hair and death masks and holding on to body parts and things that belong to dead people. I mean, it's very ancient. And so, I mean, I think one thing I found in researching that book is that that attitudes towards death are historical. I mean, they're always changing, and they're very particular to particular time periods and cultures and places. And so I think our discomfort, for the most part, our discomfort with death is our discomfort with death. And I think that the Victorians were, generally speaking, not all the Victorians, but generally speaking, I think in the 19th century, people were much more comfortable with corpses and being around corpses and collecting hair from corpses and watching people die and writing sort of very minute diaries about people dying, and, you know, so yeah, definitely. Yeah.
All right, well, that's all the time we have for tonight's conversation. Thank you so much for coming out tonight. Thank you, Deborah and Amy, on behalf of the Strand, for joining us.